Hello, in this video we are going to be talking about layout. So I want to start off with a simple example. Here we have a view that starts at x150, y10, and I put a red border around it so you can easily see the box. And it's 1,000 by 1,000 pixels. And we're going to talk about the coordinate system. So every time you create a view, that's essentially a node that you're creating, you're setting the XY coordinates of that node. And it's just like a Cartesian graph where everything starts at the top left corner. So that would be your 0, 0. And then we are moving things over 150 and down by 10. So you see the red corner starts up there. And then every element that you put inside of that view is a child of it, and the XY coordinate of that starts at 0, 0. So now we have a yellow block, and it's starting at 0, 0, and it's right in the corner there. And if we move it over by x, and let's say we move it over by 100, 100, it's going to move down and over by 100, 100 relative to its parent container. So that's how layout works. Everything is relative to its parent container. Anytime you put something in something else, it's relative to its parent container. Now I'm going to show you a couple more tricks for doing layout. So right now we see X and Y sets it from the top left, but we can also use right. So right, we can set right 0, and now we'll see the square bounces over to the right. We can also add bottom 0, and now it will be in the bottom right corner of the screen. So all this is doing is setting the mount property, to 1, which moves everything so that the corner is actually the mount. We'll talk about the mount in a second, but it sets the x equal to the full size of this, and the bottom equal to the full height of this as well, of its parent. So that's what's moving it to the bottom right corner. All right, and in order to talk about mount, we'll talk about that right now. So when you set a block, let's reset this. So the block right now is setting in its top left corner. And that's because by default, everything has a mount of 0. And the 0 means the top left coordinate. If you set mount to 0.5, that would use the center of the block as its center coordinate. So I'm going to save this, and now you'll see that the 0, 0 coordinate is the center of the block, which is a little hard to see because it's off screen. But if we also set it then to 1, that would be the corner of the block. So now you can see the corner of it is all the way up there in the top right, kind of far off the screen. I could move this to be right equals 0. But actually using right and bottom actually sets the corner, or sets the mount to 1, which is why you get this perfect alignment down the bottom there. Okay, so that is mount. And just for full clarity, or full showing off, there's a mount Y and there's a mount X, which sets your X and Y coordinates. So you don't have to do it in the center. You can do it, just change the Y version, and it's a value from 0 to 1. So you can do 0.5. And now if we mount it, you see that it moved it up in the middle of it, but the X is still the same. Okay, so now that you understand mount, there is another shortcut property called center. And what center does is it puts the block directly in the center of its parent container. And how it's doing that is it's setting, this is the same thing as setting mount to 0.5. So that sets it so that the center coordinate of the block is what we're using as the coordinate system, which is the very center dot. And in order to center something, if we know the width and height of the parent, the calculation becomes very easy. We just have to set the x equal to half the width and the y equal to half the height. So if we do that, we're going to get the same positioning. And so that shortcut is just center. You can use center. Alternatively, you can use center x and center y. And you can do them separately if you want, to move a block around to the center of its parent container. So that's a quick shortcut on how to move things around. I think we covered x, y coordinates and centering elements on the screen. with this block system. So I'm just going to leave this centered, and we're going to move on to another example here. So I'm just going to remove the hidden from this one, and we'll take a look at this next example. And in fact, we're going to hide this yellow block. So here we have a little bit more complicated of an example. We have these 3 blocks here of different colors, and we have one parent container. Now you'll notice we moved the parent container XY coordinates, which is now has this white border around it. We moved it over, and these blocks are still at X00, 0, or at least this first one's at X0, and it is relative to the parent container. So now you can see it's here, but we have a few special properties that we're using. So we're using display flex to do layout. And flex row, what it does is it goes through each of the elements and sets the X value of each of these blocks to justify the contents, or actually include a gap of it of 20 pixels. So it's setting the X to spread them out with a spacing of 20 using gap. So if we didn't have the display flex on here, so we're going to remove these real quick. Gap won't do anything, but by default, all these blocks are just stacking on top of one another, with the blue one being the last one that's created. So therefore, it's on top of the other elements. So we could manually set these coordinates, and we could say the X of this is, let's say, 80, and that will move it over. And you'll also notice that if we set display flex with row and we try to set an X here, it won't do anything because it's being overridden by the flex row, because that's now calculating your X positioning for all of these blocks. So be very mindful of when you're using flex, like it's going to override the X value. It won't change the Y value though, because the Y value is for columns. So now we can set a Y value, and if we save and reload over here, actually it won't change anything because we also have a line item center here. So align items will actually set the Y value to be the center of our block. But it's important that we set a height on the row if we want to do align item center. Otherwise, it will just keep it at the top. And here again, we put a Y equals 80 on here, which moved the block down. Yeah. Now, continuing on with the row, one of the things that you have to know is if you don't specify a width and a height for any element, let's get rid of this. The width of the element by default is equal to the parent width. So if we get rid of flex 2, you'll see the white box actually becomes bigger. So it takes up the rest of the remaining space from the X coordinate that you set, and the height is also equal to the rest of the remaining space in the parent container. So that's solid, doing that by default. Now that we used flex actually does some calculations, which says I have 3 elements. I'm going to contain those elements and update my width to be equal to the elements that are inside after I do all the spacing and gap. And it also, only for row, it also gets the first element's height and then updates the height of the container to match that height if you did not specify a height. So since we didn't specify a height here, the row is actually updating its height to be equal to the first element. And this is very useful if you have text, because then if you have text, we can create a box around it that looks really nice. But if you want to align items to the center, you can use align item center and then specify a height. This is going back, we had 300 here, and now all the items are centered. The Y value doesn't do anything, the X value doesn't do anything either. So we're gonna save that. Align items, you can also do align items. There's different values for this. We can hover over it, flex start and flex end. So if we do end, it just puts them down the bottom, and flex start is the default, which puts them at the top. So these are the different properties that you have for flex layout. Now let's move on to a little bit more useful example, because a lot of people struggle with text. I think text is one of the hardest things to kind of understand. How do I lay this out? How do I put it inside of a button? And here, when you just create a text element, you set the font size, and the line height is the height that the text will render. So whenever you do line height, that is the height of the text. So it's very useful to know that your height is always going to be 36, assuming that we're on one line. If it's multiple lines, then we have to calculate the height, which we can do that in a flex container. But let's first look at this. So if we know the height, we can set the height on the parent container, and we can create a flex box. And we can also have this cool property called padding, which is creating padding on the left and right of the hello world. So flex is automatically figuring out what is the width of the text once it's rendered, and then adding padding to it. So by default, we save it. The box would be the exact size of the text that's rendered. But if we want, we can add some padding to it, which gives us that spacing around the end. So this is very useful for buttons. And then the problem is like, well, what about the top and bottom padding? Well, if we already know the height, because we know the line height, we can also set the Y property of hello world to move it up and down inside of that box. Because one of the issues that I have, again, border is inset. So if I put a 5-pixel border around it, it goes into the box. So you want to move the text down a little bit. But you got full control just to move the text wherever you want inside the box, and it will move up and down so you can center it. So other ways of centering text if you don't want to use flex, and let's just say we have a box and the width of this, we want it to be a set width of, let's say, 200. Let's see what that looks like. And now we want hello world to be center inside of that box. So one way of doing that is using the text contain mode. And you got to do text contain, let's see, width first. Yeah, that won't do it. You got to do text actually, we do that with text align center, and that will actually put the text in the center of the 300 or the 200 pixel width. So what's happening is Solid is again seeing you didn't specify a width here, but you're using contain width. So it's going to set the width of this text element to be 200, and then it's going to contain it inside of the 200 pixel width. So if we say hello world Jimmy Dean, let's see. So that actually is breaking out of the box and it's doing word wrapping. If you don't want it to word wrap and you want ... you would do contain both here. And now it will do the ... but it's having trouble centering it because it's doing ... instead. I'll have to look into what's the proper way of doing that, but it should have centered that. So if it's smaller, it's centering it. I think the ... is throwing off the calculations for how wide it is. So maybe a bug in the renderer. All right, let's continue on. I think that's one way of doing centering of text. You can also text align right if you want. Text align left is the default, so you don't have to specify that. But this is one way to control text with the contain mode. But a lot of times, if you do need to space things out, just throw it inside of a flex container, and then the flex will automatically you can add padding to it, you can move things around, you can set margins on the text to control other things. So let's look at an even more complicated example. So we're gonna hide this, and this is something else that I was just playing with. Someone else was having this issue later. So here's a very, very complicated example. We have 2 paragraphs of text. I'm going to make this a little bigger. So we have lorem ipsum here, and we have one text. We are doing contain width. So it is wrapping automatically once it hits 450 in width, and it's wrapping. So it has nothing to do with my return on the editor. And we have 2 blocks like this. So we have 2 separate blocks, and we put a container around it to do a background color on it. And I set a margin top, so you have the ability to do a margin top. So of 5, because I have a border around the container of this, set to 5. So I want to move the top one down 5 so it doesn't mess with that border. But you'll notice that since this is display flex, the height of this is automatically updating to be the height of this text that becomes available. So now that we know the height of this text, and this one is also flex, it's also figuring out the height of this text. So both of these are updating their height. And because this is also flex, this thing is recalculating its layout when these two figure out their height. And there's another thing that we can do here. There's so many cool tricks and stuff that we can do. There's an onLayout callback function that will get triggered after layout is calculated. And you get the element, so you get this element, and you can then adjust its height again or change things if you want to. So we don't have to do this. It's actually going to lay out correctly. But we're adding another 5 pixel to the height of this just so that the border is correct. So see if we don't do it, you'll see that it cuts off the border at the bottom. So it's over top of it. So you had to add that extra 5 pixels. So we're just doing that with an onLayout callback to kind of figure that stuff out. So this is on the Solid demo app. I'll include the link in the description, but you can check out this example of how to lay out text, how to have multiple texts. And just to show you this, right, if I change the height of this and save it, you see the box automatically resizes, the text automatically resizes, everything moves up. And this is all happening behind the scenes in Flex. There's no JavaScript written to do anything except for this little layout to add a little bit of height to this element. But all this is done internally by the Flex system in Solid. So hope you enjoyed. Again, let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to like and subscribe and post any questions that you might have for future videos. Thank you and take care.